The steel bit into the granite with a high, ringing scream that echoed off the opposing cliff face a mile away. Elias adjusted his grip, his knuckles white, his shoulders burning with a deep, familiar fire. He felt the vibration travel up the length of the drill, through his arms, and settle into his teeth. He was 17, and he was quarrying a mountain by himself. The first cut was the hardest. He drove the wedge into the drilled hole, his breath pluming in the sharp autumn air. He lifted the 16-pound sledgehammer, the hickory handle smooth and worn from his grandfather's hands, and brought it down with a controlled, rhythmic force. The first strike was a dull thud, the second, a resonant clang. On the 10th, a hairline crack appeared, a pale spiderweb against the gray, speckled stone. He worked for another hour, his world shrinking to the hammer, the wedge, and the growing fissure in the rock. Beside him, a great gray dog with intelligent yellow eyes watched, its head cocked. Boulder did not bark or whine. He simply observed, a silent, furry witness to the boy's immense and seemingly pointless task. When the slab finally groaned and broke free, a block of stone 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet thick, the sound was like a bone snapping in the deep earth. It settled with a heavy sigh into the dirt. Elias leaned on the handle of his hammer, sweat stinging his eyes despite the chill. This was the first one. He needed 200. He had found the place 3 weeks after the funeral, after the quiet handshakes and the sad, pitying eyes of the neighbors had finally gone. It was a natural recess in the south-facing granite cliff that bordered the northern edge of his property. A wide, shallow cave with a floor of packed earth and a ceiling high enough to stand in. It was protected from the north wind and caught the sun for most of the day. His grandfather's journal, a worn leather book filled with spidery script and precise technical drawings, had described such a place. "The earth is the best blanket," one entry read. "Stone is its thread. A wise man does not build upon the land, but within it. He borrows its strength, its warmth, and its permanence." Elias had read the words by candlelight, the scent of his grandfather's pipe tobacco still clinging to the pages, and he had understood. The small timber cabin his grandfather had built, the one they had shared, was drafty and damp. It shuddered in the winter wind and consumed firewood at an astonishing rate. It was a temporary thing, a place to exist. Elias wanted a place to live. So he began. He rigged a stone boat, a heavy sled of green lumber, and with a system of levers and rollers, he wrestled the first block onto it. Boulder trotted ahead as Elias harnessed himself to the sled, leaning into the leather straps, his boots digging for purchase. The journey to the cave was only half a mile, but it took him 3 hours. The stone was a dead, unyielding weight, a piece of the mountain that did not want to be moved. By the time he reached the cave, his legs were trembling and his back was a single, solid sheet of pain. He left the block at the mouth of the cave and coiled his ropes. He would need to do this 199 more times. It was on his 4th trip that Mr. Gable found him. The older man sat atop his sturdy mare, his face a mask of weathered concern and disbelief. He was a good man, a practical man who had tamed his own patch of this valley with sweat and common sense. He looked at the block of stone on the sled, then at the distant cliff face where Elias had been working. He followed the deep groove the sled had already carved in the earth. "Elias," he began, his voice slow and heavy with doubt. "What in God's name are you doing?" Elias straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a raw hand. "Building," he said. The word was small in the vast quiet of the valley. Mr. Gable gestured with a gloved hand toward the cave. "Building what? A tomb? That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. You can't live in a hole in the rock. The damp will get in your bones. You'll freeze solid before the first real snow." Elias looked at the stone, then back at his neighbor. His grandfather's words were a quiet hum in his mind. "The rock holds the sun's memory." "I have a plan," he said. Mr. Gable shook his head, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "Grief does strange things to a man, son. Your grandfather, he was a good man, but he had ideas. Not all of them were meant for this world. Why don't you come take supper with us tonight? Mary's making a stew. We can talk about adding a real stone chimney to your cabin, a proper one." "Thank you, Mr. Gable, but I have work to do." The older man watched him for a long moment, his expression shifting from concern to a kind of sad resignation. He looked at the boy's thin frame, the stubborn set of his jaw, and the immense, impossible task he had set for himself. "Wait until winter," he said, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. "Winter will teach you." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Elias alone with the stone, the dog, and the weight of his conviction. Boulder nudged a cold nose into his hand, and Elias scratched behind his ears. He picked up the harness. He had another block to move before sundown. The days bled into weeks. The rhythm of the work became the rhythm of his life. Wake at dawn, eat a plate of cold beans, and walk to the quarry. Drill, wedge, and split until his arms felt like lead. Haul the stone, his muscles screaming in protest, his world narrowed to the few feet of ground in front of him. He mixed his mortar in a shallow pit, using clay from the creek bed, sand, and lime he'd painstakingly rendered from limestone in a makeshift kiln. It was an old recipe from the journal, one that promised to set harder than the stone itself. His hands, once a boy's hands, became a man's tools. They were a geography of calluses, blisters, and deep, blood-caked cuts. He barely noticed them anymore. He laid the first course of stones to form the front wall of the cabin, leaving openings for a door and a small window. The wall was 3 feet thick, a solid barrier that would integrate directly with the natural granite of the cave. He worked with a plumb bob and a level his grandfather had made, ensuring each block was perfectly set. Boulder would lie in a patch of sun at the cave's entrance, watching the slow, deliberate progress. Sometimes, the dog would let out a low, soft whine, and Elias would stop, sit beside him, and share a piece of dried venison. In those moments, the silence was not one of loneliness, but of shared purpose. The valley watched him. Mr. Sterling, the wealthy landowner from the East End, would sometimes ride by on his fine black gelding, a condescending smile playing on his lips. He saw the project as an amusing folly, a bit of local color. "Still at it, Thorne?" he'd call out, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Building your fortress? Expecting an invasion?" Elias would just nod and continue his work. Words were a waste of energy. The stone was his answer. Mrs. Gable came by twice, her face etched with a genuine motherly worry. She brought him fresh bread and a jar of apple butter, her eyes scanning the strange structure taking shape. "Elias, dear," she pleaded softly, "this isn't healthy. A boy your age should be thinking about a proper trade. You're working yourself to the bone for this. People are talking." "Let them," Elias said, his voice quiet. He was grateful for the bread, but he could not make her understand. He couldn't explain the feeling of the sun-warmed granite status as he worked inside the cave, or the deep, resonant rightness of what he was doing. It was a truth he felt in his bones, a legacy he was building, one stone at a time. Anna came with her mother on the second visit. She was Mr. Gable's daughter, a year younger than Elias, with quiet eyes that saw more than most. While her mother fretted, Anna walked the perimeter of the structure. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn stone, her brow furrowed in concentration, not judgment. "Why is the wall so thick?" she asked. Her voice was different from the others. It held no ridicule, only curiosity. Elias stopped his work, surprised. He pointed toward the cliff face, glowing in the late afternoon sun. "In the day, the sun heats the south face of the mountain," he explained, the words coming more easily than they ever had before. "The stone soaks it up. It holds the heat for hours, long after the sun is gone. This wall will do the same. The fire will heat it from the inside, the sun from the outside. It will become its own hearth." Anna looked from the wall to his face, her gaze clear and direct. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the unwavering certainty. "It's like a stone battery," she said, the thought taking shape as she spoke. Elias gave a small, rare smile. "Yes," he said, "a battery." When she and her mother left, Anna looked back over her shoulder. She didn't shake her head like the others. She watched him lift a heavy stone into place, a small, thoughtful frown on her face. He had a visitor who wasn't a skeptic. He felled 2 ancient oaks for the door and the window frame, and for the beams that would support a small loft inside. He hewed them with a broad axe, the clean scent of cut wood a sharp contrast to the mineral smell of the stone. Each swing was a conversation with the grain, each sliver of wood a word spoken. He built the chimney with smaller, carefully shaped stones, fitting it into a natural fissure in the cave ceiling that vented all the way to the top of the cliff. It was a difficult, dangerous job that involved precarious scaffolding and a constant rain of dust and rock, but the journal had been clear. A good draw was the heart of a winter home. He lined the inside with a special clay mixture that would bake into ceramic with the first fire. By the time the first frost silvered the valley floor, the shell was complete. The heavy oak door, fitted with iron hinges he'd salvaged from his grandfather's old smithy, swung shut with a solid, satisfying thud. The single south-facing window was small but thick, 2 panes of glass with a 1-inch air gap between them, another idea from the journal. From the outside, it looked like a part of the mountain had decided to grow a door. It was strange, alien, and utterly solid. He spent the last weeks of autumn hauling firewood, not just for the coming winter, but for 2. He stacked it inside the deep recesses of the cave, cords upon cords of seasoned oak, birch, and pine, until the back of the cave was a fortress of wood. He stored sacks of flour, beans, salted pork, and potatoes in a cold cellar he dug into the cave floor. He had done everything the journal had instructed. He had done everything his own instincts had told him to do. He was ready. He stood with Boulder at the entrance, looking out at the valley. The trees were bare skeletons, the sky a sheet of hammered pewter. A cold, sharp wind was beginning to blow from the north, carrying the scent of ice and distance. "Let it come," he whispered to the dog. Boulder whined softly and leaned against his leg. Winter was coming. The snow began not as a gentle flurry, but as a sudden, determined assault. Thick, wet flakes fell from a bruised-looking sky, clinging to the branches of the pines and silencing the valley. Within hours, a white blanket covered everything, and the world outside Elias's small window became a swirling vortex of gray and white. He had moved into the cave cabin a week earlier, lighting the first fire in the great stone hearth. The effect was immediate and profound. The chill of the rock began to recede, replaced by a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the mountain. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of a pot-bellied stove. It was a steady, radiant comfort that filled every corner of the small space. Elias sat at the simple wooden table he had built, watching the fire, a mug of hot tea warming his hands. Boulder lay stretched out on the stone floor before the hearth, his fur soaking up the heat, his tail thumping a soft, contented rhythm. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rose to a furious shriek. It threw itself against the cliff face, but inside the cabin there was only the crackle of the fire and the quiet sound of their breathing. The stone walls did not shudder or groan. They were indifferent to the storm, an extension of the mountain's own unyielding strength. For 3 days the blizzard raged. The world vanished. The small window was soon covered, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the fire's orange glow. Time became meaningless, measured only by the logs he added to the fire and the meals he cooked in the hearth. He felt no fear, no isolation. The silence of the stone was a comforting presence. He spent the time organizing his grandfather's tools, mending his leather harness, and reading the journal by the flickering light. He felt a deep connection to the old man, a sense of having fulfilled a long-held promise. The cabin was more than a shelter. It was the physical manifestation of his grandfather's wisdom, a testament to a different way of seeing the world. On the 4th day, the wind died. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound, deafening quiet that felt heavier than the storm itself. Elias took a deep breath. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, took up a shovel, and braced himself against the oak door. It wouldn't budge. He pushed harder, his shoulder pressed against the wood. It gave a little, scraping against something on the other side. He put his full weight into it, again and again, until he had forced an opening wide enough to squeeze through. He emerged into a world transformed. The snow was a solid, sculpted mass, reaching halfway up the door. There were no trees, no fences, no familiar landmarks, only a vast, undulating ocean of white under a pale, exhausted sky. He estimated the depth at 15 feet, maybe more in the drifts. It was a weight of snow the valley had not seen in 100 years. The air was still and painfully cold. He began to dig a trench outward from his door, the work slow and laborious. The snow was dense, packed hard by the wind. As he worked, a sound reached him, faint and muffled. A shout. He turned, listening, trying to pinpoint the direction. It came again, weaker this time. It was from the direction of the Gable farm. He left the shovel and went back inside, grabbing a pair of snowshoes, a coil of rope, and a thermos of hot broth. He strapped the snowshoes on, his heart a tight knot in his chest. "Stay," he told Boulder, who was whining with concern at the door. The dog sat, his eyes fixed on Elias. The journey to the Gables was treacherous. The snowshoes barely kept him on the surface of the deep powder. He navigated by the tops of the tallest pines, which were all that remained visible of the familiar landscape. It took him nearly 2 hours to cover a distance he could normally walk in 20 minutes. As he drew closer, the scene that greeted him was one of utter devastation. The Gables house, a sturdy timber frame structure that had stood for 50 years, was half collapsed. A massive drift had piled against the western wall, and the sheer weight of it had splintered the main roof beam. Snow filled half the house. He saw movement near the barn and scrambled toward it. Mr. Gable was there, his face gray with exhaustion and cold, trying feebly to clear a path with a broken shovel. He looked up as Elias approached, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Elias?" he croaked, his voice raw. "How? Are they all right?" Elias asked, cutting him off. "Mary and Anna are in the root cellar. We ran out of wood yesterday. The roof went this morning." Without another word, Elias went to work. His strength, honed by months of moving stone, felt boundless. He shoveled with a steady, powerful rhythm, clearing a path to the cellar doors. When they finally pulled the heavy wooden doors open, a wave of frigid air washed over them. Mrs. Gable and Anna were huddled together under a pile of blankets, their faces pale, their breathing shallow. Anna looked up, her eyes finding Elias. There was no surprise in her expression, only a profound, weary relief. He led them back toward his cabin. It was a slow, desperate procession. He practically had to carry Mrs. Gable, while Anna helped her father, who was stumbling with fatigue. When they finally reached the trench Elias had dug and saw the simple oak door set into the solid rock, they stopped. It was an impossible sight in this white, broken world. "In here," Elias said, his voice gentle. He pushed open the door. A wave of deep, radiant warmth washed over them, a physical presence that made them stagger. They stepped from the biting cold of the buried world into a pocket of enduring summer. The air was warm and dry, smelling of wood smoke and baking bread. The fire in the hearth cast a welcoming glow on the stone walls. Boulder rose from his spot and greeted them with a quiet sniff and a soft thump of his tail. Mrs. Gable began to weep, silent tears tracking paths down her chapped cheeks. Mr. Gable stood motionless in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the thick stone walls, the massive stacks of firewood, the neat shelves of provisions. He ran a hand over the stone near the fireplace. It was not just warm, it pulsed with a living heat. He looked at the simple, sturdy furniture, the well-made loft, the sheer, undeniable reality of the place. He turned to Elias, his eyes filled with a humility the boy had never seen before. "You were right," he said. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the warm, still air with the force of a thunderclap. "All this time, we were laughing, and you were right." Anna simply looked at Elias, her eyes conveying a depth of understanding and gratitude that needed no words. He had not just built a shelter, he had built a sanctuary. He had listened to the stone, and the stone had kept him safe. Now, it would keep them safe too. The Gable family's rescue was only the beginning. As Elias worked to clear more of the snow, creating a pathway out from his haven, the true scale of the blizzard's devastation became clear. The valley was paralyzed, entombed. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, and those were faint wisps against the stark white. His cabin, once an object of ridicule, became a beacon of survival. The first to arrive after the Gables was the young Miller family, their baby wrapped in every blanket they owned, their own cabin's roof having given way. Elias welcomed them without hesitation. Soon his home was a bustling refuge, the warmth of the stone walls now shared by 10 people. The space was cramped, but no one complained. They were warm, they were fed, and they were safe. The sound of a crying baby, the low murmur of conversation, the smell of Mrs. Gable's stew simmering over the fire filled the space that had known only the quiet companionship of a boy and his dog. Elias moved with a quiet efficiency through it all, ensuring the fire was fed, doling out provisions, and saying little. He was no longer the strange, grieving boy. He was the anchor of their small, stranded community. The greatest shock came a week after the storm. A figure appeared at the end of the long trench Elias had dug, a man stumbling on exhausted legs. It was Mr. Sterling. The wealthy landowner, whose grand 2-story house on the hill had been a symbol of prosperity, was humbled. His fine coat was torn, his face haggard and frostbitten. His large windows had been blown out by the storm, and his massive home was now an ice palace, his supplies frozen solid. He stood at the entrance to the cave cabin, his pride stripped away by the brutal reality of the winter. He looked at Elias, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his eyes, only a desperate plea. "Thorne," he managed, his voice a dry rasp. I was wrong. Can you spare some room?" Elias simply nodded and stepped aside, holding the door open. Mr. Sterling entered the warmth and fell into a chair, his composure finally breaking. He sat there, a wealthy and powerful man, accepting a bowl of soup from Mrs. Gable in a cave built by the boy he had mocked. The great blizzard had been a leveler, stripping away everything but the essential truths of warmth, shelter, and community. In the quiet heart of the mountain, they were all just survivors. The vindication Elias felt was not triumphant or gloating. It was a quiet, solid thing, status and steady as the warmth of the stones around him. His grandfather's status was not just in the journal's pages, but in the lives huddled safely within these walls. He had proven his point not with words, but with a roaring fire and a haven carved from the rock. When the spring thaw finally came, it revealed a valley scarred and changed. Houses were damaged, barns destroyed, livestock lost. It had been a winter of immense hardship and loss, but it had also been a winter of revelation. As the community began the status process of rebuilding, they looked at their world with new eyes. They saw the granite cliffs not as barren obstacles, but as a source of strength. The story of the cave status had spread, becoming a local legend. It was no longer Elias's folly. It was the status against which all future building would be measured. Men who had once laughed at him now came to him, their hats in their hands. They came not with mockery, but with questions. How did you know to build the wall so thick? What kind of mortar did you use? Can you show me how to read the rock? Elias, using his grandfather's journal as a guide, taught them. He was not a natural teacher, his words still spare and carefully chosen, but he demonstrated with his hands, showing them how to find the grain in the stone, how to split it cleanly, how to build a foundation that would borrow the earth's warmth. He shared the knowledge freely, understanding it was not his to own, but to pass on. The valley began to rebuild, but differently. New homes were built with thick stone foundations, often nestled into the south-facing slopes of hills. Barns were reinforced with granite buttresses. Root cellars were dug deeper and lined with rock. The community was adapting, learning the harsh lesson the winter had taught them. They were learning to work with the mountain, not against it. Through it all, Anna was a quiet presence at his side. She had understood him from the beginning, her curiosity a balm against the sting of the community's scorn. Their bond, forged in the shared crisis of the blizzard, deepened into a quiet, certain love. They spoke little of it, but it was there in the way she watched him work, in the way he brought her the first spring wildflowers that grew in the cracks of the cliff face. They were married the following autumn, in a simple ceremony held at the entrance to the cabin. The entire valley attended. Mr. Gable, his eyes shining with pride, gave his daughter's hand to the young man he had once called a fool. That winter, and for all the winters that followed, the cave cabin was filled with the warmth of family. Years passed. The valley healed and prospered, its people safer and more resilient than before. Elias and Anna raised 2 sons and a daughter in the stone house, which they expanded by carefully carving out new rooms from the rock. The original cabin, with its great hearth, remained the heart of their home. Elias became a respected elder, a man known for his wisdom and his quiet strength. He never boasted about what he had done. He didn't have to. The stone houses of the valley spoke for him. One cool autumn evening, when the leaves were the color of a dying fire, Boulder, now old and gray-muzzled, did not rise to greet Elias at the door. He was lying in his usual spot by the hearth, his breathing shallow. Elias sat on the floor beside him, stroking his old friend's soft fur. The dog, who had been his only companion during the long months of lonely labor, thumped his tail weakly against the stone floor one last time, let out a soft sigh, and was still. There was no melodrama, no great outpouring of grief. It was a peaceful, natural end to a long and loyal life. Elias sat with him through the night, the fire burning low. The next morning he carried Boulder's body to a small rise overlooking the cabin, a spot shaded by a lone, windswept pine. He buried him there, placing a simple, uncarved river stone to mark the spot. It was a passing of an era, a quiet closing of the first chapter of his life in the valley. He was no longer the boy who had arrived with only a dog and a journal. He was a husband, a father, a leader. But as he stood by the grave, he felt the familiar weight of the stone in his hands and knew that, in his heart, he was still the boy who listened to the mountain. The seasons continued their relentless, graceful cycle. Elias and Anna's children grew up, married, and had children of their own, their laughter echoing in the warm, stone-walled rooms. The cabin became a living thing, a repository of family history, its walls absorbing the stories and sorrows of generations. Elias's hands, once capable of splitting granite, grew gnarled with age, but he never lost his connection to the stone. He could still feel the coming of winter in the way the air chilled the rock, could still predict the spring thaw by the sound of the water seeping through its hidden fissures. He taught his grandchildren how to build, how to listen, how to respect the slow, patient wisdom of the earth. He outlived many of his old neighbors. He stood by Mr. Gable's grave and later Mrs. Gable's. He even attended the funeral of Mr. Sterling, a man who had, in his later years, become one of Elias's most ardent supporters, funding the construction of a stone schoolhouse for the valley's children. The world changed, but the fundamental truths his grandfather had written in the journal remained: shelter, warmth, permanence. One morning, in his 87th year, Elias did not wake up. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had built with his own hands, in the room carved from the heart of the mountain. Anna found him, a faint, peaceful smile on his face, the first rays of the morning sun slanting through the window to touch the warm stone wall beside him. The fire he had banked the night before still glowed in the hearth, a bed of deep, red embers. The cabin was warm, safe, and quiet. The entire valley mourned him. They buried him on the rise, next to the simple river stone that marked Boulder's grave. His own headstone was a single, massive piece of granite, cut from the same cliff face where he had begun his life's work so many decades ago. His sons carved the epitaph themselves, the letters deep and sure. It did not list his accomplishments or his family. It said only, Elias Thorne. He listened to the stone. His legacy was not written on that marker. It was written in the landscape of the valley itself. It was in the solid foundations of every home, in the sturdy walls of the schoolhouse, in the shared knowledge that had made the community resilient and strong. It was in the way people now looked at the mountains, not with fear, but with respect and understanding. Decades passed. The valley grew into a town. Paved roads replaced the dirt tracks, and power lines marched over the hills. The old world faded, but the stone endured. Many of the original timber structures were gone, victims of fire or rot or progress. But the houses built with stone, the houses built according to the principles Elias had taught, still stood. They were prized for their character, their efficiency, their deep, quiet strength. The cave cabin, as it was still known, was eventually deeded to the Town Historical Society. It was preserved just as it had been, a monument to the quiet, stubborn boy who had defied a community's laughter to build a home in the rock. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a century after Elias laid the first stone, a young family on vacation visited the site. The father, an architect, ran his hand over the thick stone wall, marveling at the precision of the joints, the sheer mass of it. The mother read the small plaque that told the story of the great blizzard of 1888 and the boy who saved the valley. Their young daughter, bored with the history, pressed her cheek against the stone wall near the entrance. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Daddy," she said, her voice filled with a child's simple wonder. "It's warm." The father smiled, a deep, knowing smile. He knelt beside her and placed his own hand on the granite. Even after all these years, after 100 winters had come and gone, the sun was shining on the south-facing cliff. And deep within the rock, the stone was still holding the sun's memory. It was still doing its job. The structure stood, a quiet testament, a permanent whisper of the boy who had listened, and the mountain that had answered.